In this video, I'm going to show you how to use the Nikon D3400's auto ISO function. Now, if you watched my D3400 setup guide, you know that I recommend you actually turn that off, especially if you're learning how to shoot the camera in manual mode, because giving control to the camera can undermine your ability to learn what's happening. But the auto ISO function can be a useful function, so I want to show you how it works. So the auto ISO function is found under the camera menu, and it's on the first page with the ISO sensitivity settings. Now, you can see here, first of all, you can just change the ISO in the menu, but you can also change the ISO with the function button on the side of the camera, which is much more efficient. So we're not going to worry about that here. What we're looking at is the sensitivity control and then the maximum sensitivity and the minimum shutter speed parameters for auto ISO. So obviously to enable it, we need to turn the auto ISO sensitivity control on. If you just turn it on and leave it set to the defaults, then the camera is going to do whatever it thinks it needs to do with the auto ISO to balance your exposure as best as it possibly can. And you'll see that when you go into something like manual mode, as I'm moving the camera around, the camera is changing the ISO function to balance the exposure based upon the shutter speed that I have currently set of 1/30th and the aperture that I also currently have set of f5.6. By the same token, in the aperture priority mode, it's going to change both the shutter speed, because the camera can control that, and the ISO, because it also controls that based on the auto function. And then again, in shutter priority now, the shutter speed is fixed, but it's going to change the ISO or the aperture or both to balance out the exposure. And then finally, in program auto, you've basically put the camera back into full auto mode by setting the auto ISO and also having it change the aperture and the shutter speed for you. But let's look at the parameters and how you can take a little bit more control over this. First is the maximum sensitivity. By default, it's set to 25,600, which is the highest ISO available on this camera. And some people don't like to shoot at the highest possible ISO settings because the image quality is degraded by increased noise in your image. Now, I personally feel like people obsess over that too much, and if you need to shoot at 25,600, then you should just shoot it at 25,600. But if you don't want to do that, you can limit the upper ISO that the camera is able to select when using the auto ISO function. So right now, I'm just going to go into manual mode, and you can see if I start cranking up my shutter speed, it is automatically increasing the ISO to balance out the exposure until I get to a point where it's reached ISO 25,600, and it actually now is showing that the image will be underexposed as I exceed the camera's ability to change the ISO to compensate. But if we want to limit it to a lower ISO setting, we can come in here, and let's say I want to limit it to 1600. Now, when I go into manual mode, the auto ISO is setting it to 1600 because that is the upper limit that I have set for it. And if you're going to use auto ISO, you should absolutely set this parameter based upon your comfort level with the higher ISOs on your camera. Now, the other option is this minimum shutter speed option, and this one's a little bit confusing. The idea behind this is you can limit when the camera engages the auto ISO function. The idea is you can say at anything slower than this particular shutter speed that I happen to choose, whichever shutter speed it is, then engage the auto ISO function in order to bring the shutter speed up to at least this minimum shutter speed that I have set. For example, the kit lens that comes with the camera is an 18 to 55 millimeter lens, and a basic rule of thumb for choosing the shutter speed is that you want to use a shutter speed that is close to 1 over the maximum focal length of your lens. In this case, it would be 55 millimeters. Anything lower than that, you introduce the possibility of having camera shake show up in your photo. So the idea is I want to set my minimum shutter speed for auto ISO to 1/60th of a second so that if I'm using two modes, the camera can come in. This doesn't work across all modes because if, say, you're shooting in manual mode, you control the shutter speed, which means you'll set the shutter speed to whatever you want. If you want it at 1/60th of a second, you'll just set it to 1/60th of a second. But when you're using aperture priority mode, the camera has control over the shutter speed. And if you're using program auto mode, the camera also has control over the shutter speed. And so in those two modes, when you set that shutter speed parameter, the camera will engage auto ISO if the shutter speed is going to possibly drop below 1/60th of a second. So let me show you that in action. We'll go into the aperture priority section. We're actually going to go into the ISO sensitivity and change that up to 25,600. Now, first thing we're going to do to demonstrate is turn this off so that you can see what happens without the auto ISO sensitivity control. Here I am at ISO 800, which is the ISO that I set earlier, and auto ISO is turned off. And based upon these current lighting conditions, the camera is selecting a shutter speed of 1/25th of a second. And in theory, that's going to be too slow for me to take a photo. And now go in and let's set this to on. And now we have this shutter speed set to 1/60th as the minimum shutter speed that we would want. And the maximum ISO sensitivity is set to 25,600. Now, with my camera pointed at the exact same subject, the shutter speed has been bumped up to 1/60th of a second, and the camera has set the ISO automatically to 22 or 2500 in order to compensate for that shutter speed change. Now, I'm going to point the camera at my monitor over here, which is quite bright, and you can see it's giving me a shutter speed of 1/80th to 1/200th of a second, and the ISO is back to 800 where I set it before because everything else is bright enough around it. So that shutter speed parameter allows you to let the camera back you up when it has the ability to control the shutter speed and the ISO for you. I know that's a little bit confusing. If you have any questions about how this function works, let me know down in the comments. And if you have any questions about the D3400 at all, let me know. And check this playlist because this entire playlist is dedicated to helping you understand how to use your D3400 camera. I hope you've enjoyed these videos and this user guide for the Nikon D3400. And if you want to learn about shooting photos in manual mode and how to get the best photos out of any camera, including the D3400, I'd recommend you check out my guide to shooting in manual mode, which is a video course dedicated to helping you learn how to take absolutely breathtaking photos by understanding the fundamentals of photography and what goes into making beautiful photos.